All right, so welcome to this week's Ronin seminar. We've got Emily Monosson. Did I pronounce that right?
You did. Monosson, yeah.
Monosson, excellent. Excellent. We should have that conversation before I started recording.
Okay.
And I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to her, and very excited about this. All right,
Great.
Go for it.
So first of all, thank you all for being here. And second, I'll just give you a little bit of background. This is a seminar based on a book that I just wrote. And I'm looking at this as sort of a practice seminar for one that's coming up in 2 weeks. And so when I'm at the World Wildlife Fund, and they'd asked me, this is a book that kind of combines how we can maybe reduce antibiotics and pesticides in both human health and agriculture. And they asked me to focus more on the agricultural part. So, and I will admit that that's a part that I'm a little shakier on. So if anybody has any comments, anything that can, even if I say things that they're like, what, is that really true? Whatever you want to say, please let me know, because I want to make this better. So this is a good opportunity for me, and I hope it's interesting to you. So again, thank you all for being here. So a little bit of background about the project. This came out of another project that I had done a couple of years ago. And what I was interested back then was thinking about how we use pesticides and antibiotics and all sorts of other, what I've been calling industrial age chemicals. So the chemicals that really came into being and that we've been using in our lives since, say, the 30s and 40s. And I don't really think I need to introduce some of the problems that we've had since then. We basically have become reliant on pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides to grow our food. And one of the problems with that, aside from the problem of contamination in terrestrial and aquatic systems and things like that, not to mention agricultural systems, and concerns about pesticides on our foods, is problems of resistance. And this is what I was really interested in a couple of years ago, was thinking about how all these chemicals that we use to control pests and pathogens are becoming less effective because of the evolution of resistance. And so this is just a pretty striking graph, I think, that shows the number of species that have evolved resistance. And you can see since the 40s, when we really started using a lot of these industrial age pesticides, have evolved resistance. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about weeds or diseases or insects. Similarly, we all know this, if not personally, then we've heard about it plenty from the CDC and other sources. There's a similar problem with overuse of antibiotics. We use over 35 million pounds of antibiotics a year. Much of this, as you can see, goes to livestock, but we use plenty in humans as well. And as a result, we have a problem with antibiotic resistance. And this is changing. The use of antibiotics, especially in humans. If I had brought my daughter down to the doctors maybe 15 years ago, which I did plenty because she had a lot of ear infections, she was given amoxicillin and other antibiotics, really just by me saying she has an ear infection, maybe a little temperature. And I think parents these days wouldn't have that same experience. The ear infection might be caused by a virus that wouldn't respond to antibiotics, or maybe it would go away on its own and doesn't really need antibiotics. And antibiotics in livestock is still a problem, even though it's being discouraged. There isn't any official, you need to reduce antibiotics in livestock. And so just like the problem with pesticides, you can see antibiotic resistant infectious diseases has become a big problem. And this is just a graph that projects into the future, suggesting that if we don't do something soon, deaths from drug-resistant infections are going to become a very important source of illness and death. Now, these are things that, this is Rachel Carson, these are things that, back when we started using these chemicals, say 50 or 60 years ago, were predictable. This is Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, talking about, she wasn't totally against the use of pesticides. There was a place for them, but her main thing is that we're using way too many. We're using pesticides that last too long, and as she wrote here, that pests will become resistant because of our overuse and how our over-reliance on them. And so she wrote, Darwin could scarcely have found a better example of natural selection. And this was, look at this. This is 50 years ago, and here we are. now with this, oops, sorry, I'm getting used to, I can not. Here we are again with this problem of resistance. And the same thing back with penicillin, when penicillin first came out. This is Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin, and I think everybody probably learned that story of serendipity when he found the mold on his plate and on his agar plate in his laboratory. And this is his Nobel Prize speech. Penicillin had become a very popular drug, very important drug, particularly during World War II for saving lives. But just as you see antimicrobials in just about every product that doesn't need them, there was suggestions that maybe penicillin could do that too, that they could put penicillin in all sorts of consumer products. And this concerned Fleming on top of just inappropriate use because you could buy it over the counter. And so he knew that, it could become ineffective through resistance. And so he was saying, no, please, let's not overuse it. And so, here we are 60 years later, we just don't seem to learn. And the one thing we have learned is that when we try to beat pests and pathogens into submission with our industrial age chemicals, it just doesn't work. Just about everything can evolve resistant, whether we're talking about bacteria, viruses, cancer cells, fungi, weeds, insects, even vertebrates. So the question becomes, what do we do? So several years ago when I was talking about this and talking about resistance and evolution of resistance, audience members would ask, well, what do we do about this? And, the obvious would be to use less. And so I'd say use less. And I'd always feel a little sheepish because I didn't really have anything more to say than that. I didn't have any good solutions. I didn't have any suggestions or strategies or anything else other than to say use less. And that's easy to say, and we know it's very difficult to do. There's no doubt that we are all better off because of the chemicals that have come into being in the last 50 or 60 years. Growing food is really difficult, and pesticides have made growing food much easier, and millions or billions have been fed because of the use of pesticides. And likewise, antibiotics have saved countless lives. Our lives are different because of antibiotics. But that doesn't change the problem. We recognize now, just because we've been doing something in one way for the last, 50 or 60 years, using our chemicals to control pests and pathogens, doesn't mean that the way we're using them is really the best way. That's just the change in any kind of technology or whatever it is you're doing. If we look back and could have hindsight, we might do it differently. So this might be a good time to think about that. And the problem is that, you can't just use less or get rid of it because growers have real problems. So, apple growers have to deal with things like codling moth, and this is almond orchards. Almond growers deal with navel orange worms. And, these are things we demand perfection in our fruits. No one's going to eat a wormy apple or even an apple with a little bit of apple scab. We just don't want to eat those. So we demand perfection, and growers try to give us perfection. And so there's, other kinds of, so these are, an example of pest insects. One of the real problems for strawberry growers these days is this fungus here called Verticillium Wilt. And what it does is basically strangle strawberry plants. And it's a big problem because it had been controlled, as I'll talk about in a little bit, with methyl bromide, a pretty toxic fungicide, which growers are now no longer able to use. And so what do these growers do? Other problems, if you're thinking that, well, we can do without apples and strawberries if we really needed to, potatoes. They're number 3 crop in the world. They're very important. This is Phytophthora infestans, which is a very common pest of potatoes. It kind of became infamous for its role in the potato famine, the Great Famine in Ireland. Phytophthora could turn an emerald green potato field into an oozing black mass, within days. And so it's still a problem today for potato growers. And those of us in the Northeast, at least, who grow tomatoes, might have recognized several years ago, Phytophthora began infesting tomatoes as well, in part probably because a big box grower unwittingly distributed tomatoes that were infected with Phytophthora. Tomatoes and potatoes are related. Phytophthora can infect both of them. And so now we have a problem on the East Coast as well with Phytophthora infecting our tomatoes. So, these are real problems. And the same thing with antibiotics. You can say back off from antibiotics, but we have a lot of diseases, infections that require antibiotic treatment, and we have a lot of resistant bacteria. So I think everybody's probably familiar with MRSA, and methicillin-resistant staph. It kills over 10,000 people a year. Globally, TB infects, there's almost 500 new cases of multi-drug resistant TB in the world each year. So these are big problems. And if you think that, well, TB might not be our problem, although there are pockets of the US that have TB problems, bacteria are notoriously good at sharing their resistance. And so when you hear about resistance in gonorrhea or something like that, and you think, well, not my problem, it could be your problem if those bacteria are able to share their resistance genes with other bacteria that might be more within your social realm. And then Clostridium difficile is another one, which is not only can it be antibiotic resistant, but this is also known as an opportunistic bacterium. And so this brings up another side of using antibiotics. When antibiotics are used, they're broad spectrum, which means that they can eradicate not just the pathogen, but also the beneficial bacteria. And when it does this, the helpful bacteria, opportunistic bacteria that are just kind of hanging out can take over if somebody's susceptible to that. And so Clostridium difficile is a problem for people who are on a lot of antibiotics often and or can be compromised. It's notoriously difficult to get rid of. So what do we do? This is a big problem. We know we're at an age where we really need to have a different relationship with our pesticides and with our antibiotics. And so I think this is a really good time for us to be thinking about this. We're kind of we've gone through this industrial chemical revolution where we've got these powerful chemicals, but now we're just coming into this digital revolution. And so we have really powerful computers now. So this is just a picture of ENIAC, which was one of the first computers that, filled a room, weighed a ton, and as you know, you're carrying around something like that in your pocket. And so this increase in computing power has also helped along a revolution in genetics. And so we have genomics now, advances in DNA analysis that are powered in part by computing power and part by advances in DNA analysis. And so I think people here are probably familiar with that the plunging cost of DNA sequencing, what would have cost people tens of thousands of dollars years ago, probably people who were in grad school at the same time I was, this can be now done for pennies. And likewise, the rate of analysis, so things that would have taken people months or years can be done in days or hours or even minutes. So, this is a crazy revolution in a great time. And when these things are put together, we're beginning to understand life much better, and we're understanding the importance of ecosystems and communities. And so the best example of this is really the whole microbiome revolution, which is just happening now. It's hard not to hear about microbiome. And so this is just, we are not just humans, we're an ecosystem, and we have bacteria and viruses and fungi, trillions of other little organisms living on our bodies, and we're a whole ecosystem. And so this is striking because we can now kind of visualize this, and it makes us think twice about something like broad spectrum antibiotics. And similarly, the same kind of genomics revolution can help those who are involved in agriculture and growing to recognize the importance of microbiomes in plants, or they're called rhizobiomes, all of the bacteria, fungi, viruses, nematodes that are living in root systems, and how those communities are increasingly important. And we can work with this. So we can understand, this is what I've been called, I would say this is ecology that's better informed by technology. So we understand these systems much better because of the technology. And now we can also take technology and use it in a way that's better informed by ecology. And by technology, I'm including the chemicals that we have. So what I want to talk about for the rest of the time is some examples. These are just strategies that sort of come out of this sort of all these revolutions of thinking and trying to use fewer chemicals. And so these are just sort of broad categories of how we can strategize and use and begin to sort of work with nature better work with it, understanding these ecosystems and reduce our chemical use. And so the first thing I want to talk about is that we can ally with nature. We can work with these ecosystems. And so going back to the strawberry example, I mean, this is strawberry season. If you walk into a store now, you'll see shelves loaded with big, juicy Driscoll strawberries, and other strawberries from local growers too. But, Driscoll is huge, and California is the biggest grower of strawberries in the country. And so it's an industry that has been built upon methyl bromide, really. So since the maybe 50s or 60s, when methyl bromide came into being, this is a chemical that can be used as a fumigant. And what they found was that they could fumigate the soil. They would inject this into the soil. It would basically sterilize the soil. And so then they could plant strawberries and they would grow very nicely without things like Verticillium Wilt and all of the other pests and pathogens that attack strawberries. And strawberries are difficult to grow because they're in the ground for a year. So, if you think about that, there's a lot of pests and pathogens that can arise over the period of a year. And so one of the problems was that methyl bromide is an ozone depleting chemical. And so it was actually phased out decades ago. But strawberry growers, since they were so dependent on methyl bromide, and it's also toxic, so for those who are applying and those who live near fields, methyl bromide was a problem. But really it was phased out because of the ozone problem. And so growers have had waivers up until last year. So strawberry growers were still using methyl bromide, but in smaller and smaller concentrations. And this is 2017 is the first year that they can no longer use methyl bromide. And they combined the use of it with chlorpyrifos, which is another chemical. It's also can be used as tear gas for strawberries. And so now they need to back off from those chemicals or not use them all and find ways. And so in the process of researching this book, I spoke to a couple of growers who work with a couple of extension agents from UC Davis and elsewhere that work with strawberry growers, trying to help them transition from being dependent on methyl bromide to other ways of controlling pests. And there are several different strategies that growers have used that do not use chemicals. And a couple of them, like soil sterilization with steam, you can imagine is not really conducive to working with the natural ecosystem. It's basically getting rid of whatever bacteria are in the soil. There's another method called anaerobic soil disinfestation, which is getting rid of all the oxygen requiring species. And again, that's pretty destructive to the local sort of soil biota, and if we're trying to work within an ecosystem. So what growers and those who are working with growers are trying to do is figure out ways to create healthy soil ecosystems, that rhizosphere, that can discourage disease and encourage growth. And so one of the interesting methods is planting rotational crops that recruit good, helpful bacteria and that discourage diseases like Phytophthora. And it turns out that cruciferous crops and things like broccoli can actually do that. And so one of the things that they've been encouraging some strawberry growers to try and that people have been doing is rotating crops with things like broccoli and other related vegetables. The problem is that you imagine you're facing a shelf of broccoli or strawberries. People are going to choose the strawberries over the broccoli. And strawberries are very expensive to grow. It's something like $40,000 per acre is put into those crops, and so they need to recoup that. And so this is one of the problems with that growers are just struggling with now, is that how do you keep your crops viable at the same time as you're trying to encourage use less chemicals and do so by creating healthy soil microbiomes. But there is hope, and there are other examples of wheat growers also doing the same kind of thing on a very large scale with intercropping with crops that recruit good bacteria and discourage harmful bacteria. And so this is, it sounds like this is sort of back to the future. This is a quote from Sir Albert Howard back in the 40s. So right at the beginning of this time that all these industrial use chemicals blossomed. But I'm going to read this because I think it's such a beautiful quote. This population of millions and millions of minute existences come into being, grow, work, and die. They sometimes fight each other. win victories, or perish. This lively and exciting life of the soil is the first thing that sets in motion the great wheel of life. And people are just coming back to this now. And so I think that this is a really hopeful thing that, you know, growers, even large-scale conventional growers, will start looking to, you know, growing crops that will create these beneficial communities, and it won't just be the organic growers that are doing these kinds of things. And this is happening. This is, you know, this is something that even big ag like Monsanto is starting to embrace, because they see that this is, you know, potentially a future of agriculture, is trying to encourage beneficial microbes working within the ecological system rather than just trying to attack it with chemicals. So one of the things I did in this project was to combine human health and agricultural health, because I think a lot of these strategies are very similar, and this is a perfect example. So you could say that that was encouraging a healthy soil microbiome, and likewise in humans, Clostridium difficile, is the I mentioned, is an opportunistic infection, and it's very difficult to get rid of. And so, and it tends to come in when a human's gut microbiome is compromised. And so I'm not going to say much about this except to say that one of the solutions to this problem is actually fecal transplants. And so basically just transplanting a healthy microbiome. And this is something that's now actually maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago wasn't really recognized as a treatment in the medical field. And now it is allowed through the FDA. There are ways that doctors can actually legally do fecal transplants if they're trying to treat people for Clostridium difficile. So this is just one example where, you know, the strategy is the same, and it's a way to back off from using antibiotics or back off from using pesticides to help treat a problem. And another way that we can work within an ecosystem, that way that I was just talking about is really encouraging the whole ecosystem. But sometimes there's always going to be pests and pathogens, and you can't, you know, just having a healthy microbiome or healthy rhizobiome is not going to be enough to eradicate pests or pathogenic species. And so another thing that can be done now that we understand how important communities are and how important ecosystem, you know, maintaining ecosystem integrity is that we can better target the species that are problematic, so we can get very specific. And so this example here is actually an insect example. If we go back to apple orchards, here in the Northeast, growing apples organically is very, very difficult. We all love apples, and so do lots of pests and pathogens, just like strawberries. And so in the Northeast, problems like the codling moth are responsible can destroy up to 30 to 40% of the apples in an orchard. So it's a big problem. And likewise, moths, as I showed before, the navel orangeworm moth are problematic in orchards, nut orchards, like in again in California, where a lot of nuts are grown. This is an image of an almond infected with a codling moth larva. And what happens is the moths come into these orchards. They mate, they lay their eggs on the fruit, and then the larvae burrow into the fruit, and that's how we get our wormy fruit. And so the problem in the almond industry is compounded because when the larvae do get into these nuts, they crack them open, which makes them more susceptible to infection with fungus, like fungus that produces aflatoxin. So Aspergillus flavus, AFB1 is a carcinogenic fungal toxin, and so there are rules for, you know, destroying crops that have aflatoxin in them, and so this is an economic issue on a lot of different levels. And so control is usually using pesticides. And this is just one image. I just picked out this one pesticide. There are a lot of different ones, but this is an image of the amount of use of chlorpyrifos. And I picked chlorpyrifos because if anybody's been reading the news, this is one of the pesticides. It's used to control moths in lots of different crops. This is an image of how much it's used in the United States from USGS data. And it's one of the ones that the 2016 EPA concluded ought to be banned, but the 2017 EPA decided maybe we need more research, so it's not. And if you look here, this is the purple is its use in orchards. So it's gone down over the years, and partly because the pests have become resistant and partly because there are other pesticides. But is there another solution to get rid of these moths? And when you use these pesticides like antibiotics, they're broad spectrum. And so you're getting rid of not only the pests, but also the beneficial insects. And so even conventional growers wouldn't want to do that. And so this is, it's a really interesting alternative. And so what I want to talk about right now is pheromones. And so this is a different way of getting rid of or dealing with or managing moth-like, in particular, insects. And so this story begins back in the 1850s with Jean-Henri Fabre. Don't have a good French accent, but he was a naturalist, and he had been keeping moths under a jar, and so not moths, but the larvae or cocoons. And so he had one of a peacock moth that he had under a little wire bell jar. And when the moth came out of its cocoon, he noticed suddenly his study was just swarming with these peacock moths. And it was like he was inside, one of what we go into those butterfly houses today. And so what he wondered was that moth that had just been, unfurled her wings must have been releasing some kind of scent that was attracting moths from, far away to his study. And so it was many, nearly a century later before the chemistry and the analytical chemists could actually identify what moths were releasing. They were releasing pheromones, which are sex pheromones. And moths have, if you've ever looked at, this is just, one moth antenna, but some of them have these incredibly complex antennae that can detect chemicals down to the quadrillions of a parts per quadrillion, which is an exquisitely small amount. And so what chemists and the entomologists wondered is if they could control moth populations by using these pheromones. And you can see this is a timeline here. This is 1978 when they really started to work with pheromones, and it's really taken off in 2010. And what orchard growers can do is they can take pheromones, and when they release female pheromones into an orchard, what it does is it confuses the males that are coming in, because the scent is no longer coming from a single, there's not a plume coming from a single female moth or several, a bunch of female moths in the orchard. It's all over the place. And so they become disoriented and can't find anybody to mate with. And without mating, there's no eggs and there's no wormy larvae. And so this is has been a very successful method that's actually been applied. They've been using it in the almond orchards, and pesticide use in some of those orchards has gone down 75%. Some haven't had to use pesticides against the moth that they have the pheromones for, the navel orangeworm. And it can also be used in apple orchards against the codling moth very effectively. So, and using pheromones have also been used as traps, so they can attract moths to traps, where then they can at least spray pesticide just around that area where they're attracting the moths. And they're also used to detect things like the march of the gypsy caterpillar moths across country. So pheromones is a really powerful thing, and it's just beginning to really take off. And so that's one hopeful method. And it's very specific. So rather than killing off any beneficial pests, it's just disturbing the one pest and leaving the rest intact. And so a human sort of analogy to this, which I won't go into very much, but is using viruses to attack bacteria. And this is called phage therapy. And it's something that had been used in Eastern Europe for many years, and is just sort of coming into being here in the US, being tested to see if it could actually pass the FDA's regulatory muster. And so there are viruses that are very specific for bacteria. So every bacterium, like MRSA, has a virus that can attack it. And so if you can use those viruses and treat people with viruses that can attack just MRSA, then you can get rid of the MRSA and leave the rest of one's microbiome intact. And so this is a really exciting sort of way of aligning with nature and getting very specific. And there's actually a meeting in July with FDA to try to figure out, how to try to move this into our pharmacopoeia. So I'm going to switch now for just the last part and talk about diagnostics, because if we're going to get very specific, if we're treating, want to treat just a particular disease, or we want to, get rid of a particular insect, we really need to have better diagnostics about who's out there and what the problem is. And the quicker we can do this, the better. It serves a couple of purposes. It helps growers and physicians target the problem more specifically. And also with if you have rapid diagnostics, the quicker you get to a problem, the less of a problem it will be. So you can sort of nip things in the bud. And so the example here that I want to talk about is something that I think is just really cool. It's very exciting. And it begins with a couple of researchers, David Hughes, who's a plant pathologist and entomologist at Penn State, and his colleague Marcel Salath, who's a computational epidemiologist. And so what David was thought, he grew up kind of near where the potato famine really hit the hardest in Ireland. And he came over here, and his concern was that diagnosis is really important, and especially in far-flung parts of the world, when disease hits, it can be devastating for small farmers. And so he wanted to find a way to help farmers diagnose disease better and more rapidly and get the help they need. And so we know that as extension here. All of our colleges here, all of our state colleges and universities have agricultural extension, where you can talk to somebody. But this isn't necessarily the case around the world. And also it's becoming more and more difficult to get that kind of information as funding decreases. And some of the information, there's a lot of plant disease diagnostic information. And David was becoming concerned that it's getting increasingly behind a paywall. So if you go online and look for something, a lot of times you'll hit a paywall. And so he wanted to solve this problem and provide diagnostics for everybody anywhere in the world. And so they began with this website called Plant Village, where it's really that's an online discussion board where people can come in, ask questions, and then get experts to, respond to them. But they had a much bigger plan than that, because that's sort of unwieldy, and it requires a person to answer. And so they thought, what if we could automate this? And what if we could use a system where the computer is actually doing this? And so what they turned to is machine learning or deep learning, and training the computer on images of diseased plants, and so that it can learn what the disease is by looking at images. And so this is something, and their goal is to develop a phone app where a grower might take a picture of a diseased leaf, and within seconds, they can receive a diagnosis. And I mean, this is kind of, to me, it's pretty astounding, and especially if you think of the number of different kinds of diseases that affect plants. But they've trained this on hundreds of thousands of images. They found that it works very well, and so their goal is to try to expand this and make it into a useful app, so that growers anywhere in the world could be able to just snap a picture and get a plant and get a disease diagnosis. And this is something that's really a reality. The availability of cell phones worldwide is really increasing, as is the access to cell towers. And so their hope is that they'll be helping farmers around the world with this kind of machine learning phone app that can diagnose disease. And again, this isn't just, the minute I heard of this, I was thinking, oh, if you could do that, if you could snap a picture of spots on a leaf, could you do the same thing with spots on our skin? And it turns out that, yes, you can. And so there are researchers who have tested machine learning apps and trained them on skin cancers, and they found that they really diagnose very accurately skin cancers. And so there's, the application of this is just beginning. Of course, it needs a lot of testing, but it's really pretty exciting. So that's pretty much where, there are a lot of other kinds of strategies and techniques that I explored, but I'm going to stop here in case there are questions and hopefully some discussion. I didn't touch upon prevention, so I'm happy to talk about that. I'm happy to go more into some of the strategies I discussed. But the bottom line is, I think we're at a point where, we've been reliant on chemicals, and like I said, just because we've been using them doesn't mean that we've been using them in the best or the right way, and that we need to use them all the time that we do. And now that we have these improved technologies, we can use less. We really can use less, and we can work with nature to use less. And so I just want to thank those who helped me through all this and to understand the science and to share their stories with problems with diseases. And that's all I have. So thank you. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.